In this video, we'll be demonstrating how to completely rebuild the shock on your Kawasaki KLR650. These same steps can be used for both the older 1987 to 2007 KLR650s, along with the second generation 2008 to current KLR650s. These two shocks have a few minor differences, and we'll point these out a little later in the video. We chose to upgrade the spring on this shock while we have it apart. This is a common upgrade for these bikes, as most people that ride a KLR650 find that the stock spring is too soft. If you're a heavier rider or plan on running panniers or additional gear or luggage, upgrading to a heavier spring is highly recommended. And Rocky Mountain has a few different options to choose from. We're going to need a few standard tools along with the help of a few specialty tools to help make this job easier and ensure that it's done right. So we'll start by putting on some safety glasses and then get right into removing the shock from the bike by first loosening and removing the bottom linkage nut. We'll wait to pull this bolt till a little later and move up to the left side of the bike, where we'll have to slide down the breather hose clamp and pull that hose to gain access to the top shock bolt. When you've done that, go ahead and break that bolt loose and then remove it. With the top bolt removed, we can go back down to the linkage, pull that linkage arm bolt out that we pulled the nut off of earlier. Swing that out of the way. And now all that's holding the shock on is the bottom shock bolt. We'll loosen and remove that. And then carefully pull the shock out from the bottom. It's a good idea to make sure the shock is clean before you start working on it. And we're going to start by getting access to the valve stem so we can let the nitrogen out. You'll notice there's a small plastic cap that covers the valve stem to the shock. This can be a pain to remove, but we found that cutting a small slit in the cap, like you see here, will give you something to pry against with the screwdriver and allow you to easily remove this cap. Now we need to remove any pressure from inside the shock, and you'll want to tip the shock up to keep any oil from spraying out. With all the nitrogen out of the shock, we can move on to compressing the spring. For this we need a spring compressor, and Rocky Mountain's got a couple different options to choose from. We're going to be using the Tuss spring compressor for this shock. So to start, we're going to turn up the preload adjuster, and we'll take it as high as it'll go to make sure we grab as many coils of the spring as we can. So now we'll go ahead and install a tool onto each side of the spring. And again, the goal is to grab as many coils as you can. Just snug that down for now, and we'll install the other side. Once you have them both in place, we'll start tightening each side down. We're using a crescent wrench to hold the body, and then a 17mm ratchet wrench to tighten the tool. You can also use the 3/8 drive ratchet. If you want to try and pull the spring down evenly on each side, when you have it compressed a little bit, go ahead and back out the preload adjuster to loosen up the spring. We're also going to slide the bump stop down the shock shaft, and then to remove the spring we need to remove the spring retainer. The spring needs to be compressed enough to drop the retainer down enough to slide over the shock shaft. As you can see, we have a little bit more to go. So we'll continue compressing the spring until we've got enough room to slide that retainer off. And with the retainer removed, we can back bolt the clamps off and remove those. And now you can slide that spring right off. And from here we'll move into removing the oil from inside the shock. To do that, we'll go ahead and remove the valve stem using a 10mm T-handle. It's a good idea to inspect the sealing O-ring on this valve stem while you have it removed. Now we'll go ahead and dump that dirty old oil out. Once you push all that oil out, go ahead and reinstall that valve stem, and you're going to secure the shock upside down in a vise. And using a punch or screwdriver, we're going to remove the seal cover. There's two holes in this cover, one on each side to make removing this cover easier. With that removed, you can see how dirty it is. We're going to use some contact cleaner to clean out this dirt and oil, so we don't want any of this getting inside the shock. We're also going to use some compressed air to further clean it. And now we'll need the appropriate Racetech shockhead seal setting tool. This one happens to be a 40 to 50 millimeter one. So we'll go ahead and slide that onto the shock shaft and use it to force the seal head down into the shock body. Doing that's going to reveal the two retaining clips, and this is where we'll find the first difference between the first gen and second gen KLRs. The 2007 and earlier will have the two retaining clips like you see here. The 2008 to current models only use one retaining clip. So regardless of whichever KLR shock you're rebuilding, the retaining clip or clips need to be removed. We're using a pick and a small screwdriver to remove these clips. And with those clips out, we're going to once again clean that out with compressed air. Then we'll remove it from the vise and go ahead and pull the shock apart. Be sure to do this over the oil pan to catch any oil that was left in the shock. Now's a good time to clean everything up. We're using a little contact cleaner and a rag. We'll also wipe off the piston and valving and then reinstall that bottom shaft assembly back into the vise. To get at the oil seal and dust seal, we need to remove the nut on top of the shock shaft. As you can see, the end of the shaft has been smashed over the nut, so we need to grind that down in order to remove the nut. It's a good idea to cover up the piston and valving to prevent any metal shavings or dust from getting on them. Now we can go ahead and grind that down. We'll go just far enough to where it's sitting flush with the top of the nut. Now you can use some compressed air to blow away any metal or dust, and then just remove that rag. The next step is to remove that top nut. We're using a 17mm socket with a long handle ratchet to do this. And with that nut removed, you'll want to take a screwdriver and stick it into the end of the shock shaft and then slide the piston and valving up onto it. This stack has a lot of small parts and washers, and it's critical that these stay in order. Having this screwdriver makes it impossible for these to get out of order. This is where we find the other difference between the older and newer bikes. The 2008 to current bikes have a little different piston and valving setup with more washers to keep track of, but again, just use the screwdriver to keep them all in order as you remove them. Now we can remove the seal head. You'll see the dust seal on bottom, and the oil seal sits down inside. So we offer a couple different options as far as replacements for your oil seal and dust seal. Allballs makes a complete shock head seal assembly for the KLR650 that you just install at this point. We also carry replacement dust seals and oil seals as individual pieces if you choose to rebuild your original seal head assembly. Keep in mind, Rocky Mountain ATV MC also carries replacement bump stops if yours happens to be worn out. So obviously the Allballs complete seal head assembly is much easier to install than changing the seals in the stock head, but we'll demonstrate how to change these seals for those that choose this option. And to do that, we'll start with the seal head in a vise so we can remove the dust seal with the screwdriver. Once you've done that, you can go ahead and install the new dust seal with the appropriate size socket and a hammer to drive the seal on evenly. With the dust seal installed, we can move on to replacing the oil seal. And we need to first remove this rubber O-ring. This can be kind of tricky, but we found that a flat screwdriver works best. Now you can see that there's a washer that sits underneath that and on top of the oil seal. In order to remove this washer, it's necessary to bend the edge of the seal head out with pliers. Slowly work your way around the seal head until it's slightly bent out all the way around, giving you sufficient room to remove this washer. It should look something like this. Go ahead and pop that washer out with the screwdriver. That's going to reveal the oil seal. If we remove that, you'll see that the flat side is facing down. Make sure the new seal is installed in the same fashion as the seal that came out. Now we can clean this up with some contact cleaner. Be careful as you now have that sharp edge to watch out for. So to install the new oil seal, you'll want to grease it up to help avoid tearing or damage with installation. And then with the flat side down, go ahead and slide it into the seal head. With that seal in place, we can reinstall the washer and also the outer rubber O-ring. Now you need to hold that seal head assembly firmly in your hand and at the same time lightly tap on that raised edge to fold it back down around the rubber seal and washer. Rotate the seal head and continue this pattern until you have the edge bent back into position all the way around. It should look something like this. It's a good idea to take a small file and make sure the threads on the shock shaft are clean. Spray that off with compressed air, then we can begin reassembly. So first comes the cap, And then you'll notice the edge on the shock shaft is sharp. To avoid causing any damage to either seal, we're going to slide on the Tusk Shock seal bullet. That allows us to easily slide the seal head onto the shaft. Next, we'll clean off the piston and valving, and then carefully reinstall these parts back onto the shock shaft. When you have them all on, make sure they're all seated and are ready for the top nut. You'll want to apply a little high-strength thread locker to these threads before threading it onto the shock shaft. Then we're going to go ahead and tighten this nut down and then torque it to 30 foot-pounds of torque. For a little extra security, we also chose to put a couple punch marks between the nut and the threads. The next step is to clamp the shock body in the vise, and we'll apply a little shock fluid to the piston and seal head and slide it into the cylinder. If you've rebuilt other motorcycle shocks, you know that at this point, you're trying to purge all the air from the system. Since this shock doesn't have a separate compartment for the nitrogen, we don't have to worry about the air being inside the shock. Now just push that seal head down, and again using the Racetech seal head tool, we'll force that down into the cylinder. Now you want to make sure it was pushed down far enough so you can go ahead and reinstall both the retaining clips. Just use a screwdriver to make sure they see into their grooves. And now we're going to connect our Tusk suspension pump to the valve stem and begin pressurizing the shock until the seal head moves up and seats against the retaining clip. Once it's seated, you can reinstall the cap. And the next step is to add oil back into the shock. You first want to release any pressure in the shock from seating the seal head, and you can go ahead and remove that valve stem. We're then going to measure 140 milliliters of new shock fluid and go ahead and pour that into the shock. Kawasaki doesn't specify which weight oil to use, but with the heavier spring being installed, the shock's going to want to rebound faster, so we chose to run a 10 weight fluid in this shock. Now you can reinstall the valve stem. Be sure to start it by hand so you don't accidentally cross thread it. Then you can tighten it down the rest of the way with the 10mm T-handle. And now we're ready to install our new spring. So with the shock in a vise again, we'll slide the new spring down into place. And then we're going to attach the spring compressors onto the new spring and begin tightening them down. Again, we need to tighten these until we have enough room to reinstall the spring retainer. When you've tightened them enough, slide that retainer into place, and you can begin loosening the spring clamps. You'll want to loosen them evenly and make sure the retainer seats correctly into place. Then you can go ahead and remove both those clamps. Now your shock is completely assembled. So with the install of a heavier shock spring, the shock's going to want to rebound faster, so you may need to adjust the rebound a little bit. The way you do this is remove the rebound adjuster cap. You can see the adjuster. You have 4 rebound settings starting at 1. If you turn it, you can see the 2. Turn it again, you see 3. And then finally 4. If you turn it again, you're back to 1. 1 being the fastest and 4 being the slowest. So with this new spring, we're going to try setting it at 2 or even 3 and see how it feels. You can always adjust this later when the shock's on the bike. The 2008 and newer models have a click type rebound adjuster like you see here. These have a few more settings than the older style that we just showed you. You just back it out to speed it up or turn it in to slow it down. The next thing we like to do is put a little air in the shock and check for any leaks around the valve stem. So using a hand pump, go ahead and fill it with about 15 psi, and then we'll spray a little WD around the valve stem and look closely for any small bubbles that would indicate a leak. As you can see, this O-ring has a small leak, so we're going to have to pull this valve stem out again and replace the O-ring. Since this O-ring isn't available through the OEM schematics for the KLR650, we did some research and found an OEM Honda O-ring that fits perfectly. So here's the part number for the O-ring. If you need to, you can call in and have one of our friendly customer service reps add one to your order. The last thing to do is fill the shock with nitrogen. For this, you'll need to take your shock to a trained and certified technician that can properly fill it. Most motorcycle shops are set up to do this and are usually glad to do it for a nominal fee. Kawasaki calls for 140 psi.
After your shock's been filled with nitrogen, you can reinstall it on the bike and you're ready to ride.
If you have any questions about this shock rebuild, feel free to give us a call at 1-800-336-5437. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you out on the trail.